Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Today, we're going to discuss during this specific panel, and thank you for our panelists to be here, for being here, about the new regulation that applies to open source. Gail just mentioned it before. Maybe we've been so successful that now we need to be regulated. That's a question that we need to ask ourselves as well. But the question is, what's the plan? Since we've never been regulated before, how are we going to do that as a community together? And before we start with the panel, I wanted to give a bit of context about when we talk about regulation, and if it's such a big deal, why is it such a big deal? This is written very small, but trust me, I've read pretty much all the regulations that are on the table, and even when they're written in big, it's very difficult to follow everything that's written. And these are the regulations that apply to the digital sector in Europe. Now, this, in orange, are the new regulations that were created over the last 4 years. It's more than half of them. So this is the situation, and this is why also open source is getting regulated, because the digital sector as a whole is getting regulated. Now, if we talk specifically about open source, only 3 regulations really apply to open source in a sense that they are mentioning open source as an element to be regulated inside. Those 3 regulations are related to civil liability, AI, it was mentioned before by Jan, the AI Act, and after that, the Cyber Resilience Act. That's the third one. And we'll be mostly discussing the Cyber Resilience Act today. The reason behind it's because if we want to discuss civil liability, honestly, it's a lawyer conversation. You don't want to have a lawyer conversation for 45 minutes an hour. It's going to be long and annoying. The AI Act has been discussed, and it's about safety, and we've had Stefano before, and we have both about the AI Act before as well. If you want information about this, I invite you to also join the sessions. So today we'll be discussing something that is called the Cyber Resilience Act, that is acting as cybersecurity for products with digital elements. To discuss this, we have Marta with us, who is the technical manager on cybersecurity in the Eclipse Foundation. We have Detlef, who works as ETAS as well. That means Empower Tomorrow's automotive software. You told me this just before. And then we have Cédric, CEO of OBEO, that is with us to discuss the CRA. So I'll start with the first question, probably to you, Cédric, because I think you're in a very special situation. You're CEO of a company, but the company is also a board member of foundations, in that case, the Eclipse Foundation. And the Eclipse Foundation has been very active on the CRA, and the CRA was a big threat to open source foundations originally. So my question is, we've been discussing for 2 years the CRA. How do you compare where we are right now to where we were originally, where it was pretty much a panic attack in the open source community?
Well, thanks for your question. It was quite the journey, actually, between the beginning of the CRA discussion when it appeared, and that, well, we are a French company. We are building open source technology since 19 years, and we are building it for big strategic corporations. So we're really involved into, well, reaching good level of security and so on. And as an open source community, we were improving things regarding security and how we handle all these questions of vulnerability and so on. But when the CRA came out, it felt a bit out of touch with what we were trying to do, because there was so many implications on the way we were building software in open source. And just because the definitions were very broad and the open source in itself was not recognized. So then Mike and the Eclipse Foundation will kind of amplify the voice of the members and the open source community in general. And they gathered all the open source communities to make our position known that we need something which is specifically considering open source and the projects in order to make an effective regulation. And this actually have been taken in account, and now in the CRA you have this notion of a steward, and it fits better with the way our ecosystem works. As a small company, it means that we, well, have to do some changes and figure out the changes to reach this level of conformance. But it also means that it's an opportunity to, show and get even better on security and cyber security. So now with the current state of the CRA, there are areas where we can see that maybe it could be a good thing for us also as a community to evolve and as a company to just make sure that our customer gets this value and this value gets recognized officially now.
If I try to translate what you said in very short, and I want you to see, Detlef, if you agree with this, the CRA was very bad before, now it's better, and it might actually help you improve your, or anyone's cybersecurity posture. Would you agree with that, Detlef?
Yeah, so I have been heavily involved from the very beginning. So in the automotive industry, we recognize, so the CRA might not be of so much relevance for the automotive industry because we are covered by other norms and standards. But finally, even in our own company, we had to educate the people, hey, there is an issue. If the open source community gets spoiled with the CRA, we are not allowed to use this open source perhaps anymore in our development tool chains, products, and so on. And that was a point where one colleague with from a big OEM, I personally, with him, we went to Brussels and had the meeting with the author of the CRA and to discuss and to find out why did they do it like this. I think this is important. If you only read the result, you get a wrong interpretation because you see it only from your perspective. The intention of the European Union was a totally different one. They had not in focus to spoil the open source community and so on. They wanted to address big companies who might escape from their responsibility by putting things in open source. And by this means, they spoiled also the approach for the open source community. So we pulled it back, and so we changed it in the right direction. It's always a point you need to discuss with each other to understand what is the reason behind. And only because of this, it's much, much better. On the other hand, I see even the open source community is very strong with regard to security and vulnerability management. Perhaps even better than typically the other industry.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, and therefore, even with these new regulations, they are, from my perspective, in big companies or also big open source foundations, it's well established. It might be a little bit difficult for smaller open source projects. This is a challenge.
So projects that do not have a steward, for example, projects that are, okay. Then I'd like to enter, because also of what you just said, a bit more into what's inside the CRA, right? The CRA is going to be voted, it has been voted, and is going to be published in a couple, I'd say, 3-4 weeks. In 3-4 weeks, once it's published, then we have maximum 36 months to implement the CRA, meaning that every single product has to comply with the CRA if it wants to be distributed, if the company wants to distribute it in Europe. Otherwise, it's illegal. So I want to turn to you, Marta, because you're sort of at the heart of all of this discussion, right? Stewards implementing cybersecurity policies, companies using open source components. We have 36 months maximum. Some requirements is even less than 36 months. What do you think are the biggest challenges? I know it's a hard question. You don't have to, what do you see as like top 2, top 3 biggest challenges for us to implement the CRA?
As you said, for the complete implementation of CRA, we have 3 years. But it is split into 2 parts. We have the time from now to the 2 years after the publication. And during that time, everything needs to be clarified. We have all the standards that need to be written. The CRA gives a general guideline, but it doesn't give details about how you exactly do things. And we have those 2 years to define everything. And then everyone will have just 1 year to implement. So the big challenge is for me that we have 3 years that might seem long for many, but we need to have the work done, the serious work, the planning, the architecture done in 2 years so that we can implement the CRA in our products during the last year without going back to the first phase and re-implementing everything. I will give you An example, the notion of vulnerability. There's a basic notion of the CRA. It's all around in the text. And there's a very short definition of a vulnerability in the text. When you look into the details of how vulnerability processes work, it's not black and white. There's a lot of gray area. I have every week probably, researchers who say this is a vulnerability, and the development team saying it is not a vulnerability. We have already processes about deciding how to do it, and I can tell you that the CVE guidebook, so the guidebook used by organisms giving the CVE IDs, it is dozens of pages of rules, what gets a CVE and what doesn't, and at the end, that's the CNA that is deciding, and there's a whole process of what to do if people disagree at the end still. And we need to find out if for the CRA we are using the definition from the CV program, or maybe there will be another definition, and who decides if a particular issue is a vulnerability or it's a bug, and it has way more impact than it had before. Because before, that was a CV ID for someone, okay, if we give it for something that is not vulnerability, who cares? But after the CRA, a vulnerability means everyone, the project has to fix it, and everyone has to include an update for that thing. So we need to figure it out.
And I think this is an important part. The CRA is not defining how to do. They even have no idea how to do. They request the industry, and it's not only the open source, but also the industry, to find out how to do. This gives an opportunity to shape this, to give the interpretation, how it could be interpreted. So there I see the Eclipse Foundation, for example, in a very, very strong position. They can shape the interpretation of the CRA for the open source community. And this would be a help for the entire open source community. And I'm more than keen to support here, even getting in contact with the colleagues in Brussels if we need to convince them. It's important to understand why is the CRA in place. If you're not knowing what is the purpose, you might fail with the interpretation. The key intention of the CRA by the European Union is to protect the end customers, that they are not kept alone if there is a security issue in their final product. That's the overall intention. And if our approaches in the open source environment are supporting this, I would say we are safe. But we can interpret it.
It's interesting because we started with a problem, and when I'm listening to you, it feels like we have an opportunity now. And I also join what you were saying, Cédric, before, in a sense that it's changed from an issue to an opportunity to improve. But now, listening to Detlef, it's not only an opportunity to improve, but it's also an opportunity to shape what we will have to do, defining ourselves what should be our best practices, what should be the cybersecurity practices we want to see. Do you see that as an opportunity as well for you?
Yeah, definitely. And if you're just starting at Eclipse, and it is going to shape the whole ecosystem, which is depending on Eclipse and so on. As a tool provider, which is building in Eclipse and on top of Eclipse, providing commercial products, including open source and so on, we always define our own development process based on the best practices coming from Eclipse and so on. So obviously, we are going to match the same kind of organization. So it's going to be, I guess, the same for all the other organizations. And we have way more impact in Eclipse and within the working groups. And this impact is more important on the overall open source and software industry.
Yeah, and when you say the working group, I'm guessing that you're talking about Open Regulatory Compliance Working Group.
Yeah.
So Open, just to give a context to everyone, Open Regulatory Compliance Working Group, it's a very long name for something very simple, gathering all the experts in the open source community on cybersecurity in the same room and making them work together in order to define the best practices that will allow the compliance with the CRA so that we can simplify compliance. When I say the experts in the room and in the open source community, I mean experts from Apache Foundation, experts from Rust, experts from different communities that are out there, companies as well, European companies as well. The idea being that we can define those practices. And now I'm curious, because you all have 3 different profiles working for 3 different types of organization. Now that I just described what is ORC, what do you want to see ORC doing? What's important, for example, for you, Marta? The thing that you're like, okay, we have all those experts in the room, they need to help me defining this. What would that be?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. There's a lot of things to do in CRA work.
Sure.
From the point of view of a foundation, we have those a little bit less constrained regulation, but still the regulation talks about security processes. So getting an agreement between different foundations on how we define the security processes. Do our processes today comply with the CRA or not, what we need to change? And also, 2 other things, work with the other foundation on this defining standards of the security during the whole dependency chain. Imagine you have an Eclipse project, but a typical Eclipse project has dependencies that some of them are not Eclipse projects. They come from Apache, they come from Python Foundation or everything else. And if you look into the whole dependency chain, at the end, the dependencies of those dependencies will be yet another foundation and maybe yet another project for the Eclipse Foundation. So we are interdependent in the security processes. So to have them coherent between different foundations, that is, for me, an interesting thing. And also we have an opportunity to standardize the way we do coordinated disclosure. What is coordinated disclosure? We have a problem that is common, for example, to multiple projects. We have had, for example, common flows in HTTP implementation. So it touches all servers, all HTTP servers in the world. Of course, every single one of them implemented it differently, but it turns out that there are common issues that everyone needs to fix. And to release such a fix, we need a coordination from everyone. Currently, most of the coordination efforts are per subsystem. So different groups of people do it differently. If we can come with common, unified, coordinated disclosure procedures, of course, including companies, because they are quite often really involved in those things also. That would be great, because then when we have a potential issue, we know what to do, and we do not need to figure out every single time whom to contact, how do we do it. And usually in those 90 days, for a big issue, 90 days, it can be really short.
Except if you want to react with what Marta just said, I'd ask you the same question.
Yeah.
Do you want to react?
I would like to react on this. So there is a pattern with large organizations, and we should avoid that the same pattern will apply later to the Eclipse Foundation, because the Eclipse Foundation, with a huge number of projects, is also big. Structured in a different manner, but same. The point is, if we only take the CRA and try to interpret it verbally, and I know what I'm talking about, in the automotive industry we are experts for this, then we are doing much too much. So we need to understand what is the target and then find a lean and easy solution to the problem, not interpreting word by word the CRA. This will lead to an awful situation. So for example, how can we support users, people who are using our open source projects or components, how can we enable them that they can deal with the CRA easier? Because finally they need to apply for the CRA as well, because they need to provide evidence if something is going wrong. How can we support them in a lean and easy manner from the open source community? Not putting too much burden with unnecessary structures and processes. This is the challenge. Not fulfilling the CRA by word, because there is nobody who can judge on it now. There is no lawyer who has even interpreted this. So we can shape it. And for the Eclipse Foundation, be careful that you are not falling in the same trap as big companies with standards.
Yeah? Do you have a similar position, Cédric?
I think that's interesting to look at it that way, definitely. So people are getting involved in projects, they're contributing, and so right now in Eclipse we have this Eclipse development process which has been designed and which is designed by the members of the foundation and the committers and so on. And this gives a framework so that we're sure that everything goes in good conditions and it try to strike the right balance in between formalism that you need to justify things and while being able to code and contribute, because what we want at the end of the day is to have the least barriers that on doing that. And so this Eclipse development process has been set up as a way, a part of it is to make sure that IP is managed. For instance, in the history of the Eclipse Foundation, the Eclipse Foundation provide the guarantee that the licenses are compatible with the EPL and so on. And so there are a number of steps when you develop in Eclipse, which means, and safeguards, which means we can provide this guarantee. And I see the CRA as maybe we'll need to change the development process a bit or to define some specific levels that the project might want to achieve and provide the same guarantee for users of the technology, what they need, attestation, whatever, which mean that they can, well, be compliant with the CRA. So in that way, to me, it looks a bit similar to what happened a long time ago on the IP management, except that now Eclipse is way bigger, has way more impact, and that we can work with the other foundations very well. So we are part of the working group as an SME because obviously we don't have a huge amount of resource and expertise from a legal or technical perspective. Yet, everybody has the same milestone, yet we'll need to the point where we need to make sure we're compliant and so on. And so working collaboratively with the other stakeholders, I would say, in this makes a lot of sense for us because otherwise, if we're alone looking at it, we might just read, as you said, and say, okay, we need that, and we need that, and we need that. And we don't have the power to really interpret and set a new standard into the way things should be done. So we're quite happy to join the group, and we'll see how it goes. But it's definitely going to help us move forward.
And perhaps another aspect, if you are an open source developer in your project, finally, you don't want to become famous that you are the open source project guy who don't fix the vulnerabilities.
Exactly.
Because there you might even be happy to get a little bit of support and help from the approaches or best practices which could be developed within the Eclipse Foundation. It's also beneficial for each and every open source developer, as per my understanding.
You actually got me curious about something, and I really like the idea of comparing it with IP, as in like we need to build the processes to solve that problem that could take us forever if we don't get together and find a solution to automate it or to build the different tools that will allow us to comply very quickly. I like the sort of analogy with IP in a sense that we need to figure out a way so that it can be done fast and we can bring certainty and stability to the users of our component in terms of Eclipse, but that could be also for any other foundation. And that got me very curious about what about projects? What about projects that do not have a steward or that do not have a manufacturer behind? Do you think they're going to survive the CRA? You know, for example, our working group has been mainly focusing on gathering people from, you know, the most important stewards, so open source foundations qualified as stewards in the CRA. You know, they're not there because they don't represent the steward. They don't officially have an obligation in the CRA because only stewards have an obligation. But because of the way the CRA is written, and you tell me, Marta, if I'm telling something stupid, because of the way the CRA has been written, companies will not be able to leverage an open source component that does not have a cybersecurity policy anyway, or does not follow certain things that stewards should have to follow. In a sense, in many aspects, the relevance of the open source projects reduces. So how is open source projects supposed to survive to that? Should they look at what Open Regulatory Compliance Working Group is doing? I'm asking because I know that in the audience we also have people that, you know, work on Eclipse project, but also work on other projects that don't even have a stewards, yet maybe it's a project that just initiated. They're all gonna die because of the CRA, or nobody's gonna be able to use them anymore? How do you see that, for example, Marta?
In the case, if there is no common platform for the project to decide what are the, how they feel the requirements, it will be on everyone using that open source project in a monetized way to do the due diligence. So if a project is used by 10 products, it will mean 10 separate independent due diligence processes doing basically the same. That looks as a waste of time of everyone. So I think those projects have an opportunity to organize themselves in such a way that they can do those requirements together. Maybe those 10 companies are going to fund the work needed to do it. And they can always look at into the work done as open source in the Open Regulatory Compliance Working Group and adapt the processes, adapt the templates. There are a lot of resources already, so that they can adapt and, well.
So maybe they could do that and then make sure their project stays relevant in the long term, or maybe they could just, well, see that there's a value in having a steward like the Eclipse Foundation, but you're here preaching people which are pretty convinced because it's just helping on all of that. And maybe also, I don't know, GitHub is going to provide templates and stuff so that you can do things easily.
But someone will have to do those things.
But
someone will have to.
But at the end of the day, the project lead or the project member needs to do something. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Here again, I'm mentioning it again. It's important that we interpret things in a lean way, and we're sharing best practices. Otherwise, it's not working. If somebody defining this top down, it will become a huge burden. So we need to find a lean and easy to manage solution also for small projects. And here we need also the community who helps each other. And by the way, the problem is not only with the open source colleagues. I'm recently part of yesterday I was in a meeting with the Ministry of Traffic in the state Baden-Württemberg, and we are pushing the so-called FOSS-land, where we push the open source activities within the industry, not only automotive industry, for small companies, because they have a big hurdle to use open source. They even do not know how to manage different types of licenses and so on. They are completely without knowledge on this point. So even with the CRA, they will get additional burden on themselves. And I'm talking not about big companies like Bosch or we as ETAS. I'm talking about small companies, family-driven companies with 50 people, 100 people. And they have the same problem.
We have 5 minutes left, and I'd like to open questions to the public as well. I have questions that I'd like to ask, but I think it's important also to open to the panel. I would just make one point. Shaping regulation, specifically if we have to develop standards, specification, develop best practices, argue about them in Brussels to the institutions at the national level, it costs money. It is super expensive, let's be fair. If you want to develop a standards, you need to go to standards body, you need to have an actual professional that is specializing in standards as well, because negotiating those standards is not easy. I see this as the biggest challenge possible for the open source community. How do we get the right resources so that, okay, we will reduce the cost and the resources in the end for companies, but it's still going to cost something. And I think, for example, the challenge of the Open Regulatory Compliance Working Group is you get all the right people in the room, and then you hope that they will be strong enough and experts enough so that they have the legitimacy to argue in front of policymakers. But that's going to be hard in terms of resources.
Yeah, but this is also working a little bit in a different, perhaps in a different manner. So, for example, last year we had several events at Brussels. For example, the Open Forum Europe.
Yeah.
We had sessions with representatives from the European Union sitting in the room together with us to get into the discussion with the CRA.
Yeah, the opportunity is here, I agree.
And
we can do it.
The Eclipse Foundation getting also now much, much closer to the colleagues in Brussels. I yesterday received the email that the next OCX conference will be happen where?
In Brussels.
Ah.
Well, in 2 years, right in the middle of the deadline for, you mean we could talk about it in 2026? That's an interesting, we didn't think about it. You have good ideas.
No, but see, talking with these guys, these are also human beings. They are not enemies.
No,
Yeah.
they're not animals.
Perhaps sometimes they are perceived as enemies, but they are not enemies. They are looking for the end customer perspective. And how they are doing might be perceived as the wrong approach. And if it's wrong, then we have to support them to get it in the right direction, as we manage with the CRA. It's possible.
It is.
But you need to get in contact with these people, and then it works.
Yeah.
Of course, it's time-consuming. I know what I'm talking
It is, it is. Let's go to the human in our audience. I think they have questions. I've seen one hand over there. Yeah.
I have the microphone, thank you. So, first of all, thank you for doing all this important work that we don't want to do because it's, human interaction and regulations, which is awful. But my question is there going to be something in the regulation that speaks about how to speed up the patching process? Because we've all seen the slides here, I think even twice, about the dependencies and transitive dependencies being like the major security hole. And is there something aiming at speeding up patching dependencies, like saying, I don't know, projects of a certain size need to deliver security updates?
The CRA does not contain, I would call it like this, not any indications how to do things. They tell what to do. And so if you have dependencies, you need to ensure that others might be able to utilize your information which is relevant for the CRA. So it's not a cookbook. And it's tough to read.
It is.
You need a lot of, coffee
Thank you.
or other drinks.
Thank you.
Is there any other question?
Yeah.
Yeah, right in over there. There's someone with a microphone in the back, and then
I can speak?
the man in the middle. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Great panel. And, indeed, it is not a cookbook, but at the end of the day, we'll need to implement it. So I'm wondering, do you have any takes, exactly how it could even work? Because I know there is a discussion about is it really a CVE and there are terms like affected and vulnerable, and that's when the conversation started. But I'm talking not even about that. So there are millions of dependencies, and some of them are supported by individuals. And even when CVE is reported, and sometimes there is a push, and open source very often taken for granted. So companies are pinning this individual to fix it, and he is saying why should I have even a tiny bit of sympathy, because like you never contribute back. So let's say there is a CVE, and some industries using this library. So, and it needs to be fixed. So, like, how is it going to work, at least in the ideal world? So maybe you have some, ideas about how it could be implemented even.
Okay.
I want to go first to the second question because we don't have much time. So I'd get the second question directly, and then we answer the two questions together.
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much. And when at the time when this will everything be implemented, is it already possible to say how it will influence the work of those that develop, for example, projects like Eclipse or other open source projects in the daily life, maybe?
So first question, do we already have documents that can tell us how to comply? Second question, how will that actually influence what we do in Eclipse, but in other foundation? Is that correct, the way I said it? Anyone wants to answer this first?
It will depend on the project, because I know some Eclipse projects that already have processes that I think are 95% CRA compatible. And the fact that 5% is probably writing some documentation to actually point to all those resources. And there are other projects, especially a young project on a project that weren't doing much security until this point, where it's going to take way more effort. So it all depends on the project.
So, perhaps looking at the commercial side, who are using open source, even they are forced with the CRA to do additional things on top, because if you identify a vulnerability, you are enforced to inform your customers where you deployed the software that there is a vulnerability in an active manner, which even we had to convince the colleagues at the European Union that this is not possible in open source because nobody knows in which products the open source is included. And so at least this is less to do, but how can it work? It's a question how to shape it. You can look for the big vulnerabilities we had in the industry over the last several years. How did we do this? And how did we fix this? The recent one with some libs, log4j and so on. These are all cases where you can have a look how this can be then done and managed, and this could be the starting point, because this can happen to anybody.
All right.
The CRA when we have CRA implemented, it doesn't mean there will be no security vulnerabilities.
No.
They will be there, but we will have ways to dealing with them, and there will be secure defaults, for example, and things like that. It doesn't mean there won't be vulnerabilities, because bugs are there, bugs are going to be there, and some of them are security bugs, and that's not going to change.
And I will use this as a conclusion, because I see that our master is already there. So I think answering your question, we don't have a document right now that will tell you exactly what we have to do, but that's exactly the purpose of having discussions like this. How do we create such documents? And the only answer is together, and that's why we had this panel today. So thank you very much for coming and for joining us during this panel, and thank you for listening to us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all. That was very interesting.
Awesome.
Now it's time for coffee before we run to the other conference rooms. We will be back here at 4 p.m. for the closing session. So we have a few surprises, so don't miss it. See you then.